All right. Hi. Hello, everybody. And thank you for joining us. Oh, there we go. She's starting her screen share. So I just wanted to do a quick introduction. First, thank you guys for joining us virtually. We are new to the whole virtual program scheme, and so far it's been fantastic. I'm really excited that we're able to do virtual programs now because we're able to have so many more people join us. We have many international people joining us right now, as well as people from outside of Virginia. So thank you and welcome, and a special thank you to all of our members who are joining us tonight as well. Your support helps us able to do programs like this, as well as continue the NSLM Daniels Fellowship Program. So I just want to give a brief introduction to Katrin Boniface. We're really thrilled to introduce her. She was a former NSLM John H. Daniels Fellow here. She is currently a Ph.D. candidate at the University of California, Riverside, and she studies early modern horses and horsemanship. Her dissertation addresses pre-modern definitions of breed and methods of producing horses. She earned her MA in medieval history from California State University, Fresno in 2015, and a BA in history and English from Stony Brook University in Meredith, Manor International Equestrian Center. And she still remains heavily involved in the equine industry. She was a John H. Daniels Fellowship member here, and her research areas include medieval and early modern equine nutrition, the changing definition of humane treatment, and genetic history. So we really hope that you guys enjoy the talk tonight. We do want it to be a bit more of discussion based as well. So please use your chat function to ask any questions throughout the entire program. I'll be moderating the chat and I'll be sending those questions directly to Katrin, so she'll be able to answer them throughout the program as well. So don't be shy, ask all the questions that you want. We'll also have time at the end of the program for you to ask any questions. So Katrin, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and take yourself off mute.
All right.
All right. So if you have trouble with this screen share and you want to also have the chat up at the same time, if you're not familiar with Zoom, all you need to do is go to the View Options top bar, press the drop-down menu, and press Exit Full Screen. So what it'll do is it'll split your screen. You'll be able to see her videos and her PowerPoint, as well as still be able to use that chat function to ask any questions that you like. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and take myself off video. I'm going to turn it over to you, okay?
All right. Welcome. I must say, I lived in Maryland, not actually too far from the sporting library for quite a while, and I trained up there, but I didn't get a chance to actually visit until I was living out in California, where I am now. And I'm quite sad that it took me that long to get down there, because it is absolutely fabulous. And I'm really looking forward to being able to travel again and come back and do more research. So for today's topic, reining in the beast. So we're talking about equestrian equipment, training methods, but also ideas of what it is to be a good horse trainer, and when and how these things changed. For today in particular, I'm looking at sort of the Anglo-European tradition. So we have a lot of what we consider classical horsemanship out of the European schools, which did heavily influence early American riding academies. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about for today, to sort of set the scope. So the long 18th century, and for my purposes, it is quite long, as it starts way back in 1667 or so, saw radical change in the training of horses and the discourse surrounding that practice. William Cavendish's 1667 publication of A New Method, an Extraordinary Invention to Dress Horses and Work Them According to Nature, had an enormous impact on horse training in Britain and in the colonies. It was his own translation and expansion of his earlier work, which had been in French, though he was himself an Englishman, and he dedicated it to his student, the newly restored Charles II. Cavendish is, because of this work, credited with the invention of draw reins, which we're going to see a little bit more about later. An item of tack which allows the rider to use leverage against the horse's strength. And I lost my spot already. Here we go. This is certainly not the first invention in equine management, but for the next 2 centuries or so, Equine treatises and inventions and innovations of this kind became immensely more common. In this kind, I mean those that specifically look to use leverage, to use physics, to use equipment as the go-between between the handler and the horse. Cavendish also represents a shift in thinking about what it means to be a good horse trainer. Works on training and farriery, which at the time included both shoeing and veterinary care, as well as training, breeding, and just about anything else in the care of horses that you could manage, that you could imagine. They slowly leave the domain of nobility like Cavendish and develop a rich public dialogue about the new science, the new equestrian science. From Cavendish's draw reins, and we'll get into why that's not quite the right term, to Magner's 19th century patent bridle, which was quite possibly the first gag bit. This period was a period of departures from tradition, where the new, the progressive held sway. Privilege was given to new mechanics, especially those that pit man's mind against beast's strength. In part today, I'm going to do something I tell my students, especially my history students, not to do. I am going to pass judgment. In so doing, I hope to illuminate the complexity of early modern thoughts on both animal existence and what it meant to be humane. Writing equestrian treatises was an established tradition among Europe's elite and had been for at least a century before Cavendish's first publication. While there were certainly earlier works, by his day, most authors drew on Federico Grissoni's 1550 Rules of Riding, which of course there is a copy in the rare books room in the basement of the Sporting Library. And many claimed an apprenticeship lineage going back to that Italian master. These treatises, in medieval fashion, always began with an appeal to past authorities. Thomas Blundell, in the introduction to his 1566 translation and gloss of Grissoni's book, stated that chivalry was sorely decayed and could be renewed by the daily practicing of the rules of Grisson. He goes on to point out the number of ways in which this was traditional, and who among the former riding masters in England could claim a direct descent in knowledge from that trainer. Can everybody hear me? I don't hear anyone. Okay, thank you. So Cavendish himself was, he opens his book with a bit of historiography, part biography, tracing not only the written works between himself and the Italian master, but also who rode with whom, what they learned along the way, what they brought with them. But he then claims to do something new. Whereas all the rest just place them as one more link in a long chain, he claims at least to discard them all. Of the Italian masters, including Grisson, he says they are tedious and write more of marks, colors, temperatures, elements, moons, stars, winds, bleedings, than of the art of writing, and only to make up a book, though they want for horsemanship. Meaning they can't ride, so they made up a bunch of nonsense. That's what he accuses them of. And of course, to a certain extent, he's correct. More than half of Grisson's book was indeed concerned with colors, humors, astrology, and the like. Blundell's later translation reproduced these without concern. Cavendish discards them, but he feels the need to include evidence for discarding them. And so he writes that Mr. Blundell says, and remember that Blundell is adapting but largely translating the Italian work, that the sorrel is the element of fire. We've all heard about chestnut mares, and therefore full of metal, hot and fiery. But I assure you, I have known more sorrel horses dull jades than of any other color. Cavendish seems to think this alone is not enough to convince his audience, and he continues on, writing that Blundell claims, white horses are phlegmatic, and so heavy jades. But I assure you again, I have known white horses to be fuller of spirit and livelier than of any other color, and so his elements are wrong in everything. Cavendish's advice on this subject is that the best way is to try your horse. This remains pretty good advice. He goes through Blundville's discussion of favorable markings in the same way, and finally says that there are good and bad horses of all colors and of all marks, suggesting that anyone, somebody tried to call me here, suggesting that anyone who claims otherwise are using foolish and false toys only to abuse simple people. He applies the same treatment to Blundville's writing on conformation, shoeing, management, and non-veterinary treatment. In all of these things, Cavendish says that Mr. Blundville is very much abused by his old authors and whom he reveres so much. And for those of you who don't know, Blundville was master of the horse to the king. But here he is, Cavendish, saying, no, this guy, master of the horse, he knows nothing. Right? He is abused by these old masters. Blundville's translation of Gerson had enjoyed several decades of popularity, and so was likely very well known. But it had stopped being reprinted about 50 years before Cavendish's own work. So Cavendish's extended weighing of the relative demerits of Blundville was likely the straw man that he used to support his claim of having a new, more sensible, natural, and effective method for training horses. In discussing Blundville and Gerson, Cavendish saves his best for last. Much of Gerson's work is sensible, even from a modern point of view, but there are glaring exceptions. Cavendish latches on to one of these. For a resty horse, they raise a whole town with stabs to beat him, with many curious inventions, with quirts, fires, whelps, as in dogs, hedgehogs, nails, and I know not what. While the raising of the whole town might be hyperbole, the rest is not, or at least not if we're reading Gerson as literal. So of resty horses, being those that are sluggish, Blundville writes that the shrill cry of a hedgehog being straight tied by the foot under the horse's tail is a remedy. Lacking a hedgehog, a puppy will do. He also suggests, and I think this falls under Cavendish's I know not what, a cat on a stick. Let a footman stand behind you with a shrewd cat tied at one end of a long pole with her belly upward, so she may have her mouth and claws at liberty. When your horse doth stay or go backwards, let him, the ground person, thrust the cat betwixt his thighs so that she may scratch and bite him, sometime on the thighs, sometimes on the rump, and oftentimes by the stones. So he's suggesting, or at least writes, that if your horse won't go forward, tie a cat to a stick and let the cat scratch the horse's testicles. This is maybe not such good advice. So it's quite easy for Cavendish to use this as an example of something to tear down. Of course, whether or not this was a method actually practiced, we don't know. Having discarded half of Gerson as superstition, and undermined his training authority by pulling out the most ridiculous items, anything Cavendish writes will sound sensible by comparison. He claims that his training is according to nature, and claims to be able to train 6 horses using his method in the time it took Gerson to have trained 1. So, what was this new method? Cavendish takes a brief moment to point out that he also departs from Pluvinel, who he rode with. Here he is more delicate, saying that no doubt, but he was a good horseman, while still disagreeing with his core method, being the use of pillars, and this should be available on your slide here. Of the pillars, he says that what Pluvinel pretends to be an absolute method is no more than absolute routine, and has spoiled more horses than ever anything did. For horses that are not made to the hand and the heel, for horses are not made to the hand and the heel at all with them, nor will they go from the usual place where they are ridden, nor well there either. So what he means by this is that when a horse is trained in pillars, they don't necessarily perform the same way out of them. And here I have to agree with Cavendish, in particular his point that they not only won't be able to perform, but they simply, I have a question here about pillars. So if you look at your slide here, you should be able to see there are two different images of pillars in use. And you may have come across this if you've watched any of the riding at the Spanish riding school. So the one on the right here is a horse between two pillars. And this is pretty typical. This is still used at the Spanish riding school. This was very much popularized by Pluvinel. And then on the left-hand side, you have a horse being worked in by a single pillar, which Cavendish does use a single pillar. He will not use the doubles, but he will use a single. So the single pillar ends up working in effect like a lunge line. But you notice that they have to have all of these people around to handle the horse, right? So you have the rider, you have the person handling the line to make sure that nothing gets tangled and the line stays tight, even though it's tied to the pole. You have the person with the whip. And then of course you have the riding instructor who's actually sitting down and just pointing things out to the other students that are standing. On the right side, again, with the double pillars, we see a horse being taught to kick out. And similarly, we have the trainer who is there, the one that's pointing the whip at the horse's back. And then he's sort of like chatting with his friends, his students that are hanging around. And as Cavendish mentions, that training a horse to do something in the pillars doesn't necessarily mean that he will do them outside of them. So why won't he use the double, but will use? I think in some cases, this is just him having a tiff with his own riding instructor, who is Pluvinel. So he feels like he has to use the pillars because they are tradition, but he doesn't really like them and he wants more forward out of his horses. So at least with the single pillar, you can keep them moving forward. Whereas with the double pillars, you enact the forward with the whip, but the pillars act to stop the horse, which is sort of the inverse of everything that Cavendish ends up doing under saddle. So the other major departure, and these are related, that Cavendish makes from tradition is his arrangement of the reins. And I'm going to describe this, but then I'm actually going to pull up a video because I think that's a place where it takes a little bit more description to see. So this too, he insists, must be done his way. So whether it's in the single pillar or whether they're riding loose, the reins must be arranged his way. He says to take one of the reins, which must be long, with a little ring at one end, and put the other end into that ring, and so pull it around the pommel. And I know that sounds terribly confusing. Basically means make a loop in one end of your ring, throw it around your saddle. All right. And then put the rest down by the fore bolster of the saddle. So if you see these saddles, they've got like a big padded thing just above the rider's knee. So that's the fore bolster there. And under your thigh, and the rest of the rein through the ring on the same side of the Cavesson. So the Cavesson goes on the nose, and again, we'll have a little demonstration of this. And so bring it back again, either to your hand or tied to the pommel straight. Do the same with the other rein in all things as I told you with this. So basically put the rein on the other side, the same as you did on the first side, right? So this is a lot to just say, double back your reins, basically, right? This arrangement gives the rider a great deal of leverage to use against the horse. The rein runs from the front of the saddle through the ring on the noseband and back to either the saddle or the rider's hand. This is actually different from modern draw reins, which again, we're going to watch a video in a second, which some of you might be a little bit more familiar with, though often he is credited with creating them. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the video here, and I think that's going to make this a little bit clearer. Here's a little view of Cavendish's Cavesson.
Cavendish, Duke of Newcastle, is often credited with creating draw reins or inventing draw reins.
All right, can we see that? I hope we can see that. I'm going to go to full screen and play this video, which will hopefully explain the difference between, difference between modern draw reins that you might be a little bit more familiar with, or explain what draw reins are for those of you who aren't familiar with them, and the way that Cavendish set up his draw reins. They look fairly similar on the surface, but they function quite differently.
Cavendish, Duke of Newcastle, is often credited with creating draw reins or inventing draw reins. people consider him a saint for this. Some people not so much. The thing is, he didn't create draw reins. His system is quite different. So the first thing I want to do is give you guys an example of what modern draw reins look like, so that then you have a comparison once we show you Cavendish's system. So I have here a set of driving lines, because I don't actually own draw reins. I don't have occasion to use them that often, but I can set them up similarly to the way that modern draw reins work. So what I'm going to do here, first just get all this mess out of my way. I'm going to take one of these lines, and I'm going to run it through his bit, and down between his front legs to his girth. There's a little clip down here. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Yeah, you're out of time.
All right, so we've doubled them up on both sides. They go down to the girth, in this case between the legs, though some modern trainers will put it just behind the elbow here.
So, most trainers, myself included, if I ever actually had reason to use them, will use a pair of direct reins alongside the draw reins. That way you always have just a normal rein. And that would be this here. And you can see when I pull back, he turns his head. I pull back over here, he turns his head the other way. If I pull up, his head comes up. Now, if I pull on the draw rein, head comes to the side and down. No matter what direction I pull on it, yes, you can put your head back up, buddy, it's okay. There you go. I can pull straight up, his head still goes down. So we're gonna see what that looks like under saddle. Got it there. All right, so now we're gonna see what this looks like under saddle. You can see, even though I'm not actually really touching the draw rein here, this is pretty floppy. I have a feeling that at one point in his life, he knew what these were, and he's like, okay, I'm gonna put my head down. It's fine. There we go, good boy. Now, if I do engage this draw rein, you can see his head comes in and down. If I engage the right one, in and down. And now I'm going to do it both, and you'll see his head come all the way down to his chest, almost between his legs, because that's where the lever to the line goes. And again, it doesn't matter which direction I pull, that's where his head goes. There he goes. And we'll see what that looks like in motion.
So we had a question about what's the point of all this. As I mentioned at the beginning, I've
never ridden him at knees. He is 20 years old, and his main job is to take around my little lesson kids. He takes absolutely beautiful care of them. He will not put a foot out unless I tell him it's okay. Oh.
So you'll notice there I actually wrote my hands a little high, but his head still continued to come down. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I don't often use draw reins. This is actually only the third or fourth time in my life I've used them. But they are particularly common on show circuits because people want their horses to go with their head down and in. And this is a way to use mechanics to make that happen, similar to what Cavendish was doing. Although his goal was different, the basics of using leverage, using tools, using mechanics and straps in order to make it such that the horse can only move in the way you want them to move really does date largely from that period.
Boy. And come around. Good job. So generally that's not something you'll see in a hunter ring or even a dressage ring, but it is very common to horsemanship at the period of Cavendish. So now you can tell Alpine's getting a little done with me. I'm gonna tell him, no, you still have to bend. There we go. And on forward. Good boy. There we go. Getting a little crooked here, so I'm going to see if I can lift this hand and get him to straighten out. And you can see how he moves a little bit differently through his head. Now I'm going to drop these so you can see what he's like otherwise. Of course, he knows, no, I still have to do this. But now see what happens when I pull my hand up. He's not too happy with it, but his head comes up rather than down. And whoa. Good boy. itchy. Have your cookie. All right, so this is actually at least similar to how Cavendish set up his line. It's a little similar to a driving pulley rein, but very different from what we're going to see in draw reins in, say, a hunter warm-up arena. The main difference being is that it goes directly back to the saddle and not down between their legs. If anything, he says to move them up rather than down. Sometimes he will have the loose end of the rein actually just tied to the pommel of the saddle. Obviously, he wouldn't have a horn, but he would have an archway here that he could tie it to. With his training Cavesson, it's actually fairly similar to this. This is a London Cavesson that is still in use. It's particularly common in, say, the Spanish riding school in Vienna. You'll see it has a strap here in the middle of the jaw. What this does is when you pull sideways on the Cavesson, it helps keep it from twisting into their eye. Here we have a solid nose piece with 3 rings. We have 1 on each side. These give a lot of lateral leverage. And then the center one is used for today lunging, or previously, or sometimes in the more Baroque schools, still being used for work in, say, pillows. This one does have a bit hanger that I could put a regular bit in, but it doesn't fit her very well, so I opted to use her bridle under it. Cavendish started with a Cavesson like this. He didn't start with a bit. He hated snaffles with a fiery passion, which might help explain why his student Charles I ended up outlawing them. He did ride with the Cavesson and the curb with a trained horse. His curbs obviously were a little bit bigger than hers. Can't really see in here, but this is a Mylar mouthpiece. So it's just got a little bit of roll in the middle, and you've got a little bit of flexion, but there's no actual port, so there's nothing that comes up when this engages. It does, however, still have a curb chain, and so did Cavendish's, though they may or may not have been metal like this. They had quite a variety to choose from. So one of the first things you may notice here is that my rein is coming rather.
So this this cut out here.
This should be adjusted with a nose bend a little bit lower.
But my rein's a little bit high here.
Look at a lot of the horses that Cavendish was working with. Some thoroughbreds, but especially a lot of Spanish. Not really what we would call Andalusian today, but still more of that build. A lot of Dutch. Definitely not what we would call Frisian today, but maybe a little bit more like Gelderlander. A lot of these big, long-headed horses that could really give a lot of space to a Cavesson like this. The other thing you'll notice is that she's carrying her head fairly high, and it's very easy for me to get her to flex. So these two things together allow me to prevent pretty much any horse from bucking. So a lot of what Cavendish did is he started with horses that were 6, 7, 8 years old, usually stallions, often fresh off of mountain range, very little handling. They might have been brought in and sorted at 1, 2, maybe 3, given a little basic leading lesson, and then turned back out to grow. But he wouldn't necessarily do a huge amount of groundwork. He would do a couple of days and he'd get on a ride. But he would do so in a fairly small arena. Wouldn't be a round pen like this. His was rectangular, whether it was at Bolsford in England or whether it was at what was Rubens' studio when he was in exile. In either case, a fairly small area, maybe a little bit narrower than this actually, maybe twice as long. So we had a little bit of a long side to work on to get them moving, to get a little momentum, especially with those bigger breeds. Oh, good girl. She's starting to stretch down. But with that small space and the ability to make them overflex and keep their head up, there's really nothing that even if they wanted to buck, there's not much they can do. And so that's really one of the things that he became famous with in diplomatic circles. So not equestrian circles, but diplomatic circles. Is he would bring in these diplomats from various countries and do little demonstrations with horses they were familiar with, right? And he would get them out and they would be hot and underhandled, but they couldn't do anything about what he was doing because he had the power of flexion over them. So it wasn't necessarily that he had them, immediately trained to ride, but rather that he had them fairly immediately unable to misbehave. And much like breeding at the time, that was much more the goal. It wasn't necessarily to perfect it, but rather to avoid the danger, to avoid the imperfection. So now I've gotten to a 2-rein system. So this is the next step in Cavendish's system. Now, if this horse was going to, say, buck or run away, I still have the ability to do that thing where I overflex them. And in fact, he actually did most of his training in overflexion from the start. But I can also get her working down into the curb itself, or rather, in his case, working up into the curb. There we go.
This was the hardest thing for her.
Just a little bit.
She's like, no, I stretched down.
Same as I would in the Cavesson. There we go. Good girl. And now you'll notice that not only are these driving lines too long for this, truly, but you notice I've got a lot in my hand here. It's really quite uncomfortable, quite awkward. I don't have the ability to adjust my reins the way I would if I was in a double bridle for saddle seat or dressage, right? Or even in a pelham with 2 reins, right? And that's because they're really the wrong width. So one of the things that he absolutely specified is to take a little rein, not a wide, fat rein like this, but a little rein. And that was both so it would feed easily through the rings. This one was quite hard to get through the Cavesson rings, but also so that you didn't have all this wrapped up in your hand, because it's really quite a pain in the butt. There we go. Good girl. And now I'm going to try to get her to do a couple of the overflexion exercises that he likes to work with. And they're honestly, well, I feel for his training system, they're a bit of a crutch, but they are still useful exercises for a lot of horses, especially, say, a horse like this, that sometimes has a little trouble stepping up and under. So when she was younger, we suspect that she had a bit of an accident where she likely was tied and pulled back and injured her hock. Of course, that's just a suspicion from the way that she acts and the way that she moves, but she does have a little bit of a hard time stepping under. So now I'm really asking her to flex, mostly from this Cavesson, and I'm putting that inside leg on, and I'm just asking her to move over from it. Now you'll notice to the outside, right, I don't have her grabbed in my outside rein. Her head's also crooked. And you'll notice that in a lot of the early prints for Cavendish, this is actually represented. It's pretty typical of this system because it just happens when you just pull them over, especially when you have a horse that maybe is a little bit out of condition, like, say, a stud that's 6 years old and just brought off the hills. There we go. So now I'm going to ask her to straighten her head out just a little bit by having a little bit of an outside rein. Generally, he would, instead of asking the rider to pick up on the outside rein, he would actually ask them, I'll do this now, to tie that Cavesson rein to their saddle.
This was quite awkward to do in motion.
Their outside rein. And then they would continue to ride off with their curb and one bending rein. Of course, I can't really tie this because it's really far too thick. I'll see if I can pull a dally here and get her working it anyway. Girl. So now when I ask her to flex, I don't even have to have this outside rein. It's just there for me. There we go. Good girl.
There we go. So I'm going to switch back to my slides here. So you may have noticed there at the end, I had 2 reins in one hand and 1 rein in the other. This might be familiar for those of you who have looked, say, at old military manuals. This is a very common way of riding when they go to double bridles. And Cavendish did this almost exclusively. He tended not to ride with his reins evenly in each hand. I have some fabulous questions here in the chat that I will definitely get to. Yeah, so now we've got our slides back up. And you can get a little bit of a close look at that Cavesson, and you can see it in use there. So here he has, again, he has 1 flexion ring with his rein drawn back to the low end of the saddle here. That's coming through his leg and up to the saddle. And then he has his curb, both curb reins in the other hand. So he has the curb in one side.
Hey, Katrin, your screen share is not up. So there you go. You want to pop that up?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought I had done that. All right.
You're good now. It's up.
All right. Wow, that should make much more sense then. So on the right-hand side, you have that Cavesson. You can see it's fairly similar. This one, the sides are a little bit longer as far as the stiff metal before it turns to leather. And then on the left side of the screen, you can see the setup of the reins. And here he is in all 4 of these frames. So they're all different directions, different angles. but all 4 of these frames with one flexion rein. That's the rein that goes to the lateral ring on the Cavesson. And then he has both of his curb reins in the other hand. And this ends up becoming sort of the military hand for Britain and for the US. Yes, treats are very much part of the Spanish riding school tradition. And they are also fairly common now in the general German tradition, whereas Cavendish, as far as I know, didn't mention them, which is sort of an interesting omission because Blundville at least does mention the use of grain usually, but things that are sweet to the horse. So it is sort of an interesting omission. I might have to go back and see if I had simply missed it there because it does stand out. I am very pro-cookie. And there was also a question about the French school, right? And I will be actually getting into the development of the French school in specific next, because that is sort of the next step in this trajectory. As we recall, Cavendish originally did write in French. And so his work was actually circulated far more in French before it was circulated in English, although it was eventually translated into most languages in Europe. So in 1744, so not quite a century later, Claude Beaujolais, who was then the head of the new Riding Academy at Lyon, and his work is also at the Sporting Library, he published his own method for training horses. Oh yes, natural horsemanship is a whole other thing that we will get to hopefully if we have time. So unlike Cavendish, Beaujolais' manual was meant to be followed by a large number of riders. So Cavendish took on 1 or 2 students at a time. You know, he was he was an officer, he was a military general in the English Civil War, but primarily he was the instructor to the elite and the horse trainer to the elite, and full of himself for it. But Beaujolais' work was a little bit different because he was meant to produce large number of riders at the same time through the Riding Academy at Lyon. However, he titled his manual the Nouveau Newcastle, the New Newcastle, referring to Cavendish. 10 years later, and well before the sole second edition in French was printed of the Nouveau Newcastle, it was translated into English by Richard Berenger. And I wish I had had time to add the photos of that set of books. And it is a set, it is a 2-volume set that is just absolutely enormous and gorgeous. Red leather, gold, lettering and everything held there at the Sporting Library. Unlike Cavendish or Blundville, who made their translations for kings, Berenger's is dedicated to a comparatively lowly MP. See if I can show that. There we go. So this is a copy of that translation. This is a later edition because that's the one that I had access to when I was making these slides, right? So this is quite different than all of the kingly and princely treatises that came before, both because it was meant to train large numbers of riders and not necessarily all aristocratic riders, but also just in who is being the patron of this work. But still, the new Newcastle. So what made it new? First, it dispensed with the single pillar, which was favored by Cavendish. So it did oddly include instructions for the use of 2 pillars, which Cavendish hated. It made almost no use of the Reining Cavesson, which Cavendish based his entire system on. It did use snaffles, which, as we recall, he hated, and reins reins that were attached directly to the mouthpiece, which Cavendish called false and had no use for. Beaujolais himself is appalled by trainers who would use a whip to teach the passade, which, let's see if we can have a view of that. There we go. So on the right-hand side, the woodcut there, that is a horse in passade. And Beaujolais had no use for a trainer that would use a whip to teach this. And yet, of course, Cavendish used a whip to teach the passade. In short, the new Newcastle seems to have very little in the way of technique in common with the original. So what did they have in common? The section on airs, the movements which required the horse to leave the ground, are so closely worded, so like the curvet there on the left, that if they were student papers, I'd be having meetings with them because I'd be very concerned that it was plagiarism. And then there's the overall rhetoric. So both are repetitive in the need to help the horse achieve the best their nature will allow. So their nature being both their physical conformation and also their temperament. Between these two works, between Cavendish in 1677 and Beaujolais in 1744, there develops a concept which Berenger calls to be just as a trainer, what we might call to be humane. But while modern definitions of what is humane center on the animal's experience, the picture these treatises give of justness, of humaneness, as we would call it, is centered not on the animal, but on the human experience. The first criteria is that it is effective, or as Cavendish would say, useful. Does it work? The second is that the method does not require extreme motion. Notice that Cavendish does a lot of tying the things in place and just sitting it out, letting the horse do. Or emotion from the rider or handler. So for it to be humane, the rider, the handler, must remain calm. And of course, this is a tenet that firmly removes cats on sticks from the realm of good horsemen. But it does leave room for a lot of other things that we might call into question. A century later, the menage of Cavendish and Beaujolais was struggling. Horse racing was king, the park horse in its infancy, the saddle seat horse. Riding academies were far less common than traveling clinicians, as we see today. But these clinicians, too, drew on the same rhetoric. In 1880, an American named Dennis Magner patented a new type of bridle that I mentioned at the beginning. And he went on tour to show people how it worked, and later wrote a book on what he called the most humane and effective training in the world. He saw no need to open with a litany of prior masters, as his experiments alone were enough to prove his method. His bridle, like Cavendish's rein arrangement, however, made use of the increased force of a pulley system. Let's take a look at that. So that's there on the left. So that's his patent bridle. It uses a pulley that goes up the cheek piece and back down to the bit, which gives additional leverage to the rein, pulling the bit up in the horse's mouth. And this is a strap-activated gag bit. Bits like this with far less force than this double pulley that Magner uses have come under fire recently for their ability to cut the horse's cheeks just completely open. But despite this amount of extreme pressure and despite Magner's use of throwing rigs, and that is what we see on the right-hand side, and there were a few other things in here that I would have liked to make demonstration videos for. Where's this? Go back. There we go. This was definitely not one of them. So with this throwing rig, and this is one of his later versions, which got increasingly more complicated because that meant that he was the only one that can do them, right? So he has a bit in the horse's mouth. He has a surcingle on, so around the horse's middle. He has one hoof tied up to that surcingle. He has a crupper to keep the surcingle from pulling forward. He has a line that goes from the surcingle to the bit, back to the surcingle, allowing it to have leverage, much like the patent bridle or like Cavendish's reins. And then he has the end of the line. And he was very specifically endorsed by the SPCA. He was considered a very natural trainer. He was, in fact, very often compared favorably to an Irish trainer that was active about half a century earlier. That is the earliest known case that I have found of the term for horse whisperer. So that would have been early 19th century. So all of this seems very counterintuitive to what we think about when we think about natural horsemanship or what it's supposed to be, or about horse whispering. I mean, we may have heard horror stories, but that is different than what the ideal in our heads might be. But this was the ideal, because once again, they are focusing in not on the animal's experience, but on the humans. So when men like Manor or Reining, who became pretty famous in Britain, although he was known there as the American horse trainer, the Americans didn't particularly like him. He had a similar system where he would tie a horse's leg to itself, which is still in use. These days, we just call it a one-leg hobble. That's it. So that method is still in use. They were both referred to as being particularly humane and gentle and so much better for the horse than all the trainers that had come before them. And the main piece of evidence that was given for this is that, say, Manor, with this rig, once on the horse, could hand the end of that line to a, quote, frail old lady. And she could just hold that line and step back, and the horse would fall over and be unable to do anything wrong. So much like with Cavendish's rig, it wasn't so much about necessarily creating the beautiful movements, which was a goal of his, but rather about preventing the horse from doing anything violent itself without the rider needing to enact or feel like they were enacting that violence. So it's using the gear to stand in for that. And I think I'm going to go ahead and end it there. That way we do have a few minutes for questions, because there were lots of great questions in here and I want to make sure that I don't miss any. Do we have questions?
Could you go back and answer that question that Jean had sent?
Yes, yes. So, so as I mentioned, so Beaujolais does sort of take over, sort of, the mantle of Newcastle and uses that in the creation of the first French riding academy within the tradition of the Cadre Noir. And so a lot of the equipment that comes out of there is actually directly descended from Cavendish's system. They're all, slight variations on each other, much like, now we've started adding in, well, now in the last 20 years or so, straps that go around the hind end as well. So we have things like the Pessoa system and the Mustang system. Oh, the question, when did they stop? They didn't. So there have been minor changes and innovations in them.